Hello, you're watching Ukraine This Week. I'm Jonasz Lewiński, standing in for Don Arlesk, who's currently reporting from the Czech Republic. And I'm here to bring you the latest updates from Ukraine from the last couple of days. First, let's begin with our news flash. Despite holding the line, Ukrainian troops are struggling with a lack of artillery ammunition. With Russia continuing to advance on all fronts, the situation on the battlefield could soon deteriorate if the promised Western aid doesn't arrive soon.
As the sun rises over the war-torn landscapes of eastern Ukraine, the weary eyes of soldiers reflect a conflict entering its third harrowing year. Ukraine's military now openly acknowledges that the situation on the frontline is becoming dire. The relentless two-year clashes drained the nation's ammunition reserves and diminished its fighting force. The troops voice a common refrain: a dire need for reinforcements.
Currently, at this stage, Russians are advancing, and they have ordnance to shell us with. We'd rather get tired than just sit out here hiding. We are shelled, and we have nothing to fight back with.
Moscow's recent offensive near Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city, threatens to exacerbate the situation, potentially redirecting critical resources and stretching Kyiv's defenses to a breaking point. But despite the hardships, Ukrainian soldiers aren't losing their spirits.
I'd rather we fight, we spill our blood, we defeat our enemies, than our children. We are battling an enemy that wants to not only take our territory, but to wipe us out. We have to understand this and stand up until the end.
Despite the US Congress approving a substantial $60 billion military aid package, a global scarcity of artillery shells looms large, suggesting Ukraine may remain outgunned by Russia. The exact extent of the new US weaponry reaching the front remains unverified. However, during a recent visit to Kyiv, Secretary of State Antony Blinken reassured Ukraine of the coming aid.
We're rushing ammunition, armored vehicles, missiles, air defenses, rushing them to get to the front lines, to protect soldiers, to protect civilians.
President Volodymyr Zelensky has publicly denied any artillery shortages, but has urged Western nations to speed up support, lamenting their decisions on military aid have consistently lagged by a year.
David O'Sullivan, the special envoy for the implementation of EU sanctions, has announced that Brussels is currently discussing an unprecedented number of sanctions against Russia. This move marks a significant escalation in the EU's punitive measures against Moscow.
Speaking at a joint press conference with Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski in Warsaw, O'Sullivan highlighted that the latest round of sanctions represents the most exceptional range the EU has ever imposed against Russia.
An unprecedented degree of sanctions seeking to deny Russia access to the technology needed for sophisticated weaponry, to reduce the revenue available to the Russian government, and to impose a high cost on the military-industrial complex for this devastating war and this unprovoked aggression.
European Union diplomats are reportedly working diligently to finalize the 14th package of sanctions before Hungary assumes the EU presidency in July. The urgency of the matter stems from concerns about Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban's close ties to Russian President Vladimir Putin. Orban has a history of obstructing aid to Ukraine and efforts to impose restrictions on Russia. Adopting sanctions within the EU requires unanimous agreement among member states, making the consensus-building process particularly challenging. As Hungary prepares to lead the EU, the bloc's unity and resolve in supporting Ukraine and holding Russia accountable will be tested.
Now, throughout the week, Russia carried out daily attacks on Ukrainian cities, killing and injuring dozens. Kharkiv is taking the heaviest toll, as Russia has launched a new offensive aimed at capturing the city.
This is Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city, with a pre-war population of nearly 1.5 million. Now, day by day it's being reduced to rubble by Russian attacks. This is Sergei, resident of Kharkiv and owner of a printing house, responsible for production of almost half of Ukraine's books in recent years. Now, his business is gone.
These destructions have wiped out my entire past life. It has rendered all those years of mine and my team's hard work meaningless.
Several of his workers were killed in the attack, adding to the long list of victims of Russian aggression.
Some people were burned to the point where we could not identify their gender. That smell, that sight, it's still in my head, in my heart. It's the most awful consequence of war.
But as Russian missiles fall on residential areas almost daily, more and more civilians are killed and wounded.
Russia uses over 3,000 guided aerial bombs against people per month. Thousands of aerial bombs are raining down on people's heads, whatever weapons, training or protection one might have.
With renewed offensives in the north and east, Russian bombardment is not going to stop anytime soon, causing more death and destruction. But despite increased Russian pressure, Ukrainian army holds its positions, and in the tactical dimension, the situation remains stable.
In the midst of the relentless conflict in Ukraine, a moment of rare tranquility allows for creativity to bloom on the front lines. Ruslan, a Ukrainian soldier, finds solace in sketching comics during his brief respite from military duties.
Kharkiv, a city close to the Russian border, has endured continuous bombardment since the onset of the war. Despite a failed attempt by Russian forces to seize the city in 2022, the region remains the focal point of the conflict. A former engineer with no prior combat experience, Ruslan joined the Kharkiv Territorial Defense Unit as the Russian invasion commenced. His perspective is clear. He views the war as a pivotal moment where every man must rise to defend their homeland against the Russian onslaught.
Everybody will have to fight. If men are afraid, do not want, or for any other reason do not join the Ukrainian army, they will end up serving in the Russian army after the Russians come. And they will end up fighting against Ukraine, Poland or Finland.
Through his art, Ruslan captures the stark realities and the point aspirations of life in the trenches. His comics are a window into the daily existence of soldiers, their fears and their dreams. One striking illustration depicts the Ukrainian soldier resting on the Black Sea shores of Yalta, gazing towards the iconic Swallow's Nest castle in Russian-annexed Crimea. This drawing, Ruslan says, symbolizes his hope for Ukraine's ultimate triumph in the war.
When things get tough, I sit down and put all my problems on paper. This helps me a lot. At first, I just did it for my friends. They seemed to like it, but then gradually I started drawing just for myself, as therapy.
In the face of adversity, Ruslan comics are not just personal reflections, but serve as a beacon of resilience and visual testament to the indomitable spirit of Ukrainian people.
And now it's time for our Frontline update. Every week we provide you with the latest information on what's going on in Ukraine, and this week is no different. So let's take a glance at the map of Ukraine to see what has been going on recently. And overall the situation remains fairly stable despite the dramatic reports from various parts of the country. We can see that the occupied areas, including the illegally occupied Crimea and the Donetsk and Lugansk regions, this remains more or less the same. We've also obviously heard about the fact that continuing shelling, problems with the delivery of ammunition to the front lines, this is something that we hear almost weekly. One other thing, a very important aspect here, is the Kharkiv region. Now, Kharkiv region isn't anything new either. We've already heard how important this city is. Ukraine's second biggest city is being pummeled by Ukrainian artillery and missiles. But what matters in particular is the risk of further attacks. Now, Vovchansk and Liptsy, these are the two areas which are most exposed to Russian strikes. Given how close to the border they are situated, and given the determination with which Russia is throwing its soldiers regardless of losses, using older and older pieces of equipment. Recently on the front lines, actually a T-54 tank has been spotted. These were manufactured in the late 1940s, just to give you a perspective. Still, Russia really doesn't care. What they want is propaganda victory. Also, they want to inflict maximum casualties, and they want to move closer to Kharkiv. Now, according to a recent report of the Institute of the Study of War, despite amassing tens of thousands of troops, essentially, more than 50,000, perhaps closer to 70,000. This, at least, is the overall objective. Russia doesn't really have the manpower to capture the city of Kharkiv or to encircle it outright. Unfortunately, what they can do, and what they actually may be intending to do, is to inflict maximum damage on the city, destroy its infrastructure, terrorize its people. Of course, the determination of Ukrainians remains steadfast. But there is always a breaking point somewhere. And now the crucial question obviously has been the recent decision of Western countries to allow Ukraine to use Western weapons to strike not only Russian units inside Ukraine, but also those located beyond its borders. And this includes an announcement, or at least what we expect to be an announcement later on. So far, these are just news trickling in from the US administration that the US will allow Ukraine to use the American weapons against targets located near Kharkiv. So no deep strikes far beyond enemy lines, but being able to fire back against small units located just beyond the border. Now, this seems to be within Ukraine's grasp. So this would be a major boon for Ukrainian forces. Hopefully, it would allow Ukraine to push back against Russian units which continue to attack Vovchansk-Liptsi and to push towards Kharkiv. And now, let's take a look at some images from the Ukrainian front lines, which, of course, depict what we have been telling about and which show the dramatic situation that Ukrainians have to deal with every single day. And now it's time for a glance at the conflict from a journalist's perspective. Joining me now is Zarina Zabriskie, Ukrainian journalist. Hello and welcome.
Hi there. I'm actually an American journalist. I am based in Ukraine and I do cover Ukraine, but I write for American and British newspapers. Thanks.
Okay, sure, I do apologize and we'll remember about that later. Still, it is all in the Ukrainian spirit what we're talking about, right? So basically, we're talking about matters related to Ukraine, so this may serve as a slight excuse on my part. Nevertheless, let us actually go to the merit of the case, as it were. The recent diplomatic offensive of President Zelensky has been making the headlines. It was postponed due to the critical situation in the Kharkiv region. However, President Zelensky did see it fit to conduct this diplomatic effort in order to ensure that Ukraine will be able not only to survive, but also to thrive in the company of its international partners. So can you give us a brief outline which countries President Zelensky visited and what were the tangible results of these talks?
Right. By the way, I am actually at this moment in the city of Kharkiv, and I could see why President Zelensky took the decision prior to his visits to delay it, because every day the situation is dire. This moment, the rescue operations are continuing from the night bombardment when about 6 people already, I think it was confirmed, were killed, but there's still bodies being found under rubble. So it's happening every day. It's really hard. Their situation, as you have mentioned, in Lipsy, getting harder. And meanwhile, the diplomatic efforts are really critical at this moment because there's several things ongoing. On the one hand, there was this meeting in Brussels where President Zelensky wasn't present, but the vice president, deputy prime minister actually for European and Euro-Atlantic integration for Ukraine, Olga Stefanishina was, and she outlined Kyiv's expectations for the NATO summit in Washington in July. And of course, this is something that President Zelensky is preparing for as well. Why is it important? Because at this summit in Washington on the 9th through 11th of July, there will be the discussion of Ukraine's NATO membership. And we're already getting signals from the US ambassadors that NATO is to send a signal about Ukraine's membership. So that would be quite interesting.
How decisive do you think this signal is going to be? Because we've also heard reports that some diplomats believe it for Ukraine to be acting unreasonably, believing that there will be anything concrete. On the other hand, naturally, it is a question of NATO having or not having a backbone, right? It is about values. So we know that it should provide Ukraine with a very clear path to membership. But the big question is whether the decision makers will be able and willing to do that. So what is your take on this? Are we going to hear something that could prove to be a breakthrough in this regard?
Well, there have been signals coming from various sides, and we know it will be positive. And while we might not have the immediate decision on Ukraine's membership, Zelensky, for instance, said that the summit must be productive, it's a quote, and that Ukraine believes that this cannot be achieved without addressing the issue of Ukraine's invitation to NATO. And then we also know that the Secretary General of NATO, Stoltenberg, said that NATO will be taking a greater coordination role in providing equipment and training for Ukraine. Also, each side, both Ukraine and the Western allies are confirming that air defense is on the top of the list. So whether Ukraine ends up becoming a member is still a question mark, but there definitely will be positive developments. At least this is being signaled to us.
So, of course, it's a question of weapons deliveries, it's a question of air defenses, also of bilateral treaties and deals which are being made between Ukraine and other countries. Let me ask you one final question, since you've mentioned you're currently in Kharkiv. Can you give us a brief outline of the situation there? Is it basically the case that you can actually see this sort of gradual destruction that some of the media are talking about, the city slowly, grindingly being turned to rubble by the enemy onslaught? Or are we still a bit further away from this dramatic fate?
Well, I'm looking outside the window right now, and I can tell you that this is not probably applied to the right city. What you are describing could be applied to the city of Kherson, when bombardment have been happening for pretty much every day since November 2022. And that city is, in fact, being turned into rubble. And we have a lot of other cities that are no more, such as Bakhmut or Avdiivka. Kharkiv is still standing. It's incredible how beautiful it is still, with bombardments and with the missiles and drones targeting it every day. And we have to understand that it is a very big city. Its pre-war population were at 1 million and a half. It's not easy to destroy a city like this. That having been said, certainly the Russian military are attempting to use the scorched earth strategy on the Kharkov. And what I've seen today is a horror scenario. You have a part of the building just missing in the middle of the residential area, and all around about 25 buildings, residential buildings, were damaged. Some worse, some just survived with broken windows. But we're speaking about 25 injured, about 5 killed, and there's still people, like I've mentioned before, under rubble. And it happens nightly and daily. At this rate, it will still take them a long time to destroy such a big city.
Well, of course, I hope we will never see this happen. But this is also something that the West will be responsible for, ensuring that Ukraine can fend off these attacks and defend this beautiful city. Zarina Zabriskie was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your observations.
Thank you so much.
Now, this week has been busy for Ukrainian diplomacy as President Zelensky visited several countries to sign numerous security agreements. His diplomatic tour precedes the Ukrainian Peace Summit, which will be held in Switzerland.
On Friday, President Volodymyr Zelensky arrived in Stockholm to take part in the third Ukraine-Northern Europe Summit. The high-level meeting was meant to strengthen cooperation between Ukraine and Northern European nations, with a focus on air defense and joint arms production.
It is worth saying again and again, you are literally fighting not only for your own freedom, but also for our freedom and our security. This is why supporting Ukraine is such a fundamental, existential task for Sweden and for all the other Nordic countries.
The meeting was also attended by the Prime Ministers of Denmark, Norway and Iceland, along with the President of Finland. These countries, all members of NATO, have consistently supported Ukraine in its efforts to enhance security and stability in the region.
Now we have security commitments from all Nordic countries. We have donated a lot and we are all willing to donate more. Soon Danish F-16s will be on their way to Ukraine.
Earlier in the week, Zelensky visited an airbase in Belgium, where the F-16s intended for Ukraine are stationed. Throughout the week, the president signed security agreements with Belgium, Portugal and Spain, granting Ukraine billions of euros worth of weapons. These diplomatic efforts precede the Ukrainian Peace Summit scheduled for July in Switzerland. Its aim is to bring together representatives from over 90 countries. Kiev's postulates for the conference include the return of all territories captured by Russia, war reparations, and the establishment of a special tribunal to prosecute Russian war crimes.
Putin is very afraid of the peace summit. He thought that 90 countries would not support us. He disrupted the summit and continues to do so. And that is why he is now thinking of setting up a parallel platform.
The Ukrainian leader rejected the idea of inviting Russia to the summit. Zelensky has consistently maintained that direct negotiations with Russia are off the table until Moscow forces completely withdraw from Ukrainian territory, including Crimea.
And now we're going to discuss the latest political developments in greater detail. Joining us here today is Kira Rudik, leader of the Golos Party and also vice president of the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe. Hello, and once again, welcome to TVP World.
Hello, and thank you so much for having me.
Good to see you again. So my first question, if you were to name the biggest political event of the recent week when it comes to Ukraine, a positive one, which one would it be?
Well, I think it will be still a group, right? At this previous week, it's the signing of the security agreements. And we understand how critical it is because basically it is a safeguard for Ukraine against any political changes in the country and changes of power, because it is signed on behalf of the country and not on behalf of just a certain politician. Right now we see that most European politicians are in support of Ukraine and they are speaking on behalf of their people. However, we understand that these things could change over time, and it is very important that right now we will have those security agreements and assurance that in 5-10 years we will still have the support from our allies. It is very critical in this planning part of our military on what we can take into the account.
So, of course, you're referring to the question of the bilateral agreements being binding, even if the same kind of agreements might not necessarily be forthcoming from, say, the European Union, because there are countries, and we know which ones, which are less likely to be willing to help Ukraine. You know, despite the moral correctness of doing so, they have their own political interests, right? So bilateral agreements are circumventing that. They are a way of ensuring that there is no such risk. Now, what would you say would be the top priority for the summit in Switzerland? Because this is making the headlines, right? Everyone is preparing for it. What would you expect to happen?
Well, I think we need to understand that there are no expectations from some groundbreaking happenings, right, at the summit. It will be yet another step in our diplomatic work to make sure that we unite far more countries than before in hearing our voice and supporting Ukraine. There are actually three directions that the summit will be concentrating on, and we think that it's, again, not only the democratic countries of Europe and North America, but all other countries that can be our allies, such as South Africa, India, Indonesia, potentially Singapore, Vietnam, and many others, that they will agree with us on certain things. First is the nuclear security. It is critically important, and it is everyone's problem, and we know that, and they know it as well. Second point is the food security. Ukraine has been exporting grains to African and Eastern countries since the beginning of full-scale invasion, and we intend to do that. And we need to make clear that Russia is the country that is stopping us from feeding the world. And the third priority is, of course, the exchange of the prisoners of war and making sure that we return our people back home. I think, again, this is something everyone can agree on and support us in this path and help us to put additional pressure on Russia. Because right now, what we see is that besides the fact that the democratic world is supporting us, it is very hard for the sanctions to work because there are many countries that are not supporting it. It is very hard for us to stop Russia from getting the new technologies because, again, there are many countries that are trading both with Russia and democratic countries, and just helping them to receive and deliver what is necessary for them to continue the war, a little bit more expensive, but still possible.
No, of course. I mean, it's something of a curse of the free market, isn't it? I mean, I'm quite sure you were referring to China delivering components to Russia. But also recently there were reports that the Czech ammunition initiative has run into a problem. Namely, some countries want to trade both with the West and with Russia. And Russia sometimes just comes along and says, look, we can give you prepayment. We're going to buy these shells. Don't sell them to everyone else. So, in theory, it's competition, except, there are human lives at stake too. There is democracy at stake. Do you think that we actually have the power to negotiate with countries which are on the fence, so to say? Countries like China, countries of the global south, which do not really have a stake in this conflict, or at least they think they don't. However, there are many ways in which we can actually discuss things with them. Perhaps we could actually show them our point of view in this conflict.
I think the most important step is step one, to let them hear and show them our point of view. Because right now, and you're absolutely right, they are dealing with Russia. And not only that Russia is able to prepay some of the deals, they are also able to pay cash because they are not so responsible for the international market and do not have to obey to the certain rules. So, of course, it is very hard to fight against someone who doesn't accept any rules. But this is why we are trying to first sit everyone on the table and hear what is happening. And I think their main goal is to raise everyone above the economic or trade issues to saying, look, we are talking about this concept of our future, that it is either the rule of law or it is the rule of the power. And which one would you choose? Because at some point you may find yourself in the situation when your neighbor is attacking you and you have nothing to fight with.
That's precisely the point. It's also a message to autocrats all around the world. Because we're slowly running out of time, one quick question. Rule of law or rule of strength, right? But what if Western countries insist that, we have to make some sort of peace deal? What if they are swayed by arguments that the conflict had better be frozen and that victory is impossible? Can you actually say for sure that, Ukraine has the diplomatic prowess to show them that this is not the way? Because we in Central and Eastern Europe, we know that, but they might not be aware of this fact.
Our main question is this: who or what will be able to assure us that Russia would not attack again? The war did not start 2 years ago. It started 11 years ago when Russia annexed Crimea. And at that moment, we also were sure that it is possible to freeze the conflict, to have some agreement. Everybody is reasonable. Let's figure out the way so the less people die. And it did not work. Russia was able to concentrate more powers and attack us again. And we already have seen that. This is why I have not seen any single strong argument of someone proving us that they can make it so that Russia would not repeat what they have already done.
So it's about learning from experience. Essentially, Ukraine knows what it is all about. Eastern European countries do as well. But also the question of basically raising awareness of the priorities and of the fact that it doesn't make sense to prolong it. It makes sense to defeat this evil once and for all, if possible. Kira Rudik, Ukraine MP, was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you, and glory to Ukraine.
Following a new Russian offensive in the Kharkiv region, Kiev is increasingly raising pressure on allies to lift restrictions on the use of Western-provided weapons against military targets inside Russia. The West has so far hesitated with the decision, but that is changing rapidly.
French President Emmanuel Macron has publicly expressed his support for Ukraine's right to strike military bases on Russian soil, from which Moscow launches missile attacks against Ukraine.
Ukrainian soil is being attacked from bases in Russia. So how do we explain to the Ukrainians that we are going to have to protect these towns and basically everything we are seeing around Kharkiv at the moment? If we tell them you are not allowed to hit the point from which the missiles are fired.
The debate over whether to lift the ban on Ukraine's use of Western-supplied weapons to hit targets inside Russia has divided Western leaders. While some argue that such strikes are necessary, others have expressed reservations, although that seems to be changing.
Ukraine has every possibility under international law for what it is doing. That has to be said explicitly. It is under attack and is entitled to defend itself.
The situation is particularly relevant given the intense fighting in the Kharkiv region close to the Ukrainian-Russian border. Russia carries out daily attacks from its side of the border. This prompted NATO to adopt a declaration in support of NATO allies lifting these restrictions for Ukraine.
We have the right to support Ukraine without becoming a party to the conflict, because we are helping Ukraine to uphold the right for self-defense.
With more and more Western leaders changing their stance, the question remains whether the US will fully follow. For now, Joe Biden has allowed to strike targets only near Kharkiv.
So let's take a glance at the issue in greater detail with our special guest. Joining us now is John Sweet, retired U.S. military intelligence officer, former chief of staff, intelligence directorate in U.S. European Command, who is also a contributor to the New York Post, The Hill and Kiev Post, among many others. Hello and welcome once again to TVP World.
Hey, thanks for having me back on the show.
So let us begin with breaking down the question of restrictions. Where are we standing at this stage when it comes to European weapons and in particular when it comes to US weapons? Because they, in a way, form a category all of their own.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not really confident in where we are with restrictions. Prior to yesterday, restrictions were pretty clear. It was you would not use weapons provided by the United States or NATO to engage targets in Russia, and that standard's changed within the last 24 hours, at least from the perspective of the United States. Now there's the countries in a number of NATO partners have authorized or believe that it should be that they should be able to defend themselves. And again, my concern is the word defend, because if you have to wait for them to fire upon you when you can see them, then you're still giving the initiative to the enemy. But it's a step in the right direction that they're allowed now to fire back at these targets as they're presenting a threat to them.
I think that's the way that's being interpreted by some publications, that it is about counterfire, right? It is about striking back against sites from which these projectiles are incoming, especially towards the Kharkiv region. Now, would you say that when it comes to the fact that we don't really know the exact scope of these restrictions now, is it a good or a bad thing? I mean, the Russians also have to be second-guessing, so I will be thinking, right, is our military installation located over there still within range? Is it forbidden for Ukrainians to strike it, for Ukrainian forces? Or will they actually be able to strike it? Will it be open to interpretation? Can we say for sure? I mean, do we really want Russians to know exactly what we're doing, or do we want to keep them guessing?
It's a great question. It's and when you read the fine print, and when you listen to what's being said versus the actions that are being done, it's hard to understand exactly what authorities have been given to Ukraine. I understand from what I've seen is the authorities that they're allowed to fire back. There are some reports now, at least in the Western media, that President Biden had at one time authorized the use of U.S. weapons for strikes into Ukraine. But again, that's and of course it's secretive, so you don't really know the full extent of the authorities that were released. Again, the argument that I make, and the same argument that my co-author Mark Toth and I make, is just reactionary, and you can't win a war by fighting on your heels and being reactionary. The U.S. military in the Middle East is authorized to strike targets that pose an imminent threat to the safety and welfare of American service members. And I think that Ukraine ought to have that same right. They shouldn't have to wait for the impact. They should be able to identify the threat that is being posed immediately and counter that threat before it's launched against them. And I also think they ought to have the ability to interdict Russian forces as they're moving into their assembly areas before they cross the border. So it's still a work in progress. It's a step in the right direction, but the momentum is slow, and Russia's able to capitalize on that. Look, Russia's going to figure out right now. I think the key word is defense in Kharkiv. So Russia's just going to move their forces to another area along the border, and we're going to continue to be in a reactionary mode on what Ukraine is authorized to do.
So now, what we seem to know, for the time being at least, is that anti-aircraft systems will be able to be deployed against Russian aircraft before these actually cross into the Ukrainian territory. So no more waiting until the missiles are fired and then shooting at the missiles. Now, if you see an enemy aircraft on the radar, you can shoot it down using, for example, a Patriot battery. So that is a step in the right direction, isn't it?
Absolutely, it's a step in the right direction. And Ukraine has utilized what we call a Patriot ambush on 3 occasions, and they've been very effective against bombers, but they also been very effective against command and control aircraft and surveillance aircraft. So they have established a good, what we call TTP, techniques, tactics, and procedures, as far as getting those Patriot missile batteries in position, firing, and then pulling back. So
it was a high-risk tactic, though, wasn't it? I mean, for the record, they did lose 2 launches at one point.
They have. It's not without risk. But nonetheless, the payoff, the surprise, and again, the first 2 ambushes were completely by surprise for Russia, and Russia is able to react and have countermeasures. So it's a constant game of action, reaction, counteraction. So, and that's where we are today. But no, aircraft coming into Ukrainian airspace, or aircraft that are approaching Ukrainian airspace with ordnance, in this case, hypersonic missiles or ballistic missiles, you ought to be able to engage them if they pose a threat. And you don't have to wait for them to launch the missile. You know that they pose a threat. So why not strike them before they release the missile? Better yet, from my perspective, why not hit the air bases from which those aircraft are being launched from, so they don't have the opportunity to repeat that cycle the next day?
Well, of course, I mean, this provides a deterrence factor as well. I mean, we've recently seen the Israeli air defense in action. And, you know, we can only dream of having, like, the sort of luxury, even here in Europe, like of a system like the Arrow 3. It can intercept an enemy missile beyond the Earth's atmosphere, so far away from any target. This is something that's beyond the reach of Ukrainian defenders, but this shows like the extreme to which advanced technology can actually take us. Now, speaking of advanced technology, there have been some critical comments about Russian radars being hit by Ukrainian drones far into the Russian territory. Some of these actually form part of the nuclear safety network. Do you think that this criticism was justified, though?
No, it's Russian propaganda. Look, if that radar system, that early warning radar system, or that guidance system is providing data for Russian missiles or aircraft that are going towards Ukraine, it's a legitimate military target. Period. So to hide behind that type of discussion that, you know, this is for defense only, no, it's not. And they are legitimate military targets, and they should and could be struck by Ukrainian munitions.
So one final question. When it comes to weapons which cannot be used against Russian targets yet, or weapons which are not available, which of these would be the most critical? There has been talks about the use of ATACMS beyond Ukraine's borders. This seems to be off the table, at least for the time being. Also, no Taurus missiles. Still, would you say that there is anything else that Ukraine really needs when it comes to striking back? I'm not including anti-aircraft systems because they are always needed and they are always necessary to protect cities. But let's leave that for a moment and concentrate on weapons which allow Ukrainians to hit enemy targets and provide deterrence.
Sure. Those precision deep strike weapon systems that you talked about, ATACMS and the Taurus missile system, are critical, particularly because ATACMS is fired from the HIMARS system. And look at the damage that HIMARS did to Russian ground forces in May and June of last year, and take that and apply that to what they can do to Russian ground forces in Russia as they're assembling and preparing to attack. So that's critical. The Taurus gives you deep strike capability against Russian installations, airfields, and deep into Crimea. Now, the other weapon system, of course, is going to be how are they going to allow the F-16 when it's eventually introduced into the Ukraine theater of operations? Are they going to allow the F-16 to engage in deep strike targets, or is this just going to be a close air support, or what we call a CAP, flying air defense type of mission over Ukraine? But no, those three weapon systems are critical. Now, the cluster munitions, again, while controversial, when you have 30 to 50,000 Russian infantrymen, the best tool is artillery, and cluster munitions works well too. So that's always going to be a discussion too.
So when it comes to F-16s, at least there were some positive signals. The European partners to Kiev are indicating that they will be imposing no major restrictions there. Perhaps this sort of obsession with escalation is gradually waning. Hopefully it will disappear altogether, at least in places where it counts, especially at the Pentagon. John Sweet was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your expertise.
Hey, thanks for having me back on the show. I appreciate it.
And that's all for now. I'm Jan Szeliński. You've been watching Ukraine This Week. Thank you very much for being here with us, and see you again soon.